you might have gathered, the next hour is going to be a seminar in the Deep South. This book of yours, Howell, is a wonderful omnibus. It's about 1/3 family history, about the Raines family and the Best families of central and northern Alabama and your coming of age. 1/3 Civil War history, about an Alabama unit called the 1st Alabama Cavalry, 2,000 men who fought with the North against the South, and 1/3 diatribe against the myth of the lost cause, the romantic story of the gallant Old South, which is a story that covers up the history of enslavement behind the Civil War. Let's start with the memoir part. You were raised in Birmingham in the 50s and 60s, the front line, or one of the front lines of the Civil Rights Wars. And you came up in a prosperous New South household in the steel town of Birmingham. But your grandparents, and before them, were northern Alabama people, close to Appalachia in geography and in spirit. You write, "We were hill people, come to town." Tell us about those hill people in northern Alabama.
Thank you, Edward. It was let me first say how pleased I am to be here with you. I'm a great admirer of Edward's book, Slaves in the Family, and more pointedly, for this purpose, he's quoted on page 54 of my book from his most recent book, Life of a Klansman. So I am so pleased to be here with him. The Appalachian Mountains were full of small farmers who were not slaveholders and who did not support politically the idea of secession. In Alabama section of the Appalachians, there are about 22 to 26 counties that elected anti-secession delegates to the Alabama Convention of 1861 that took Alabama out of the Union. The fact that so many of them were anti-secession reflected the fact that even the most pro-Confederate historians in Alabama acknowledged that in 1860, at least half of the white people of Alabama opposed secession. That's among the many stories that have been buried in the lost cause inundation of Civil War history. Getting back to my family, my mother is from a county known as the Free State of Winston because it produced only 100 bales of cotton and had even fewer slaves in the last year before the war. And they were not only not participants in the slave economy, but they were Jacksonian Democrats. Not to be confused with Stephen A. Douglas, pro-slavery Democrats of the 1860 election. Jacksonian Democrats harkened back to Andrew Jackson's comment in 1840 to John C. Calhoun, "The Union, sir, must be preserved." Their core principle was that the constitutional union was too sacred a thing to be broken up over the issue of slavery. Not to dwell too long on that history, but the thing I should say about my family, one, Birmingham did not exist at the time of the Civil War, and is pretty much devoid of the normal Civil War statutes and so forth. In addition, I was born into a family on both my father and mother's side that was devoid of Confederate nostalgia. I never saw in any of our homes, in my family or our extended family, many aunts and uncles, a single picture of Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee. And it took me many years, starting at a very young age, to figure out why that was.
Yeah. So your family were Republicans from Reconstruction down to Nixon, if I'm not mistaken. What does it mean to be a Republican in the Old South and not a Democrat?
Well, in Alabama, to be from Winston County meant that up until 1953, when I would visit my grandmother and grandfather's farm, we went on dirt roads. Weston County, in the village where my grandparents lived, did not get telephones until I was a freshman in college. So I saw what one Alabama historian called a maroon frontier. They were systematically discriminated against in paving and education expenditures because of supporting the Union in the Civil War. Even those events had been virtually written out of Alabama history, but the punitive attitude toward unionism persisted even into my lifetime. And I think the incident, Edward, in his wonderful book, Life of a Klansman, says, to write a life story from scattered or thin sources is like making a mosaic. A little piece of tile here, a chip of color there, and something from the scrap bin until you have a picture. Archaeologists work a similar process. And I quoted that because it captured an element of my experience. Around 1950, when I was 6 or 7 years old, I was sitting in my grandmother's garden in Birmingham, Alabama. And she doted on me because I was the only one of 8 grandchildren named for her husband, Howell Raines, who died in 1914. I was constantly pestering her for stories about life up in the country.
Yeah.
My parents would tell stories about growing up in the country and fishing in the creeks and finding Indian arrowheads in the fields. And I thought this was some sort of prelapsarian paradise rather than the poorest county in Alabama. But to a city-bound kid, it seemed like I had missed this wonderful rustic experience with waterfalls and wonderful forests. This is really hilly country. There are canyons and so forth. So my grandmother and I were sitting there. She was born 6 years after the end of the Civil War. And this incident, as best I can reconstruct it, took place around 1949 or 1950. I wanted to know about Grandpa Raines, who'd been dead by that time since 1914. She said, well, one day we were walking down the road near our farm, and we saw a neighbor coming toward us from the nearby farm down the dirt road, and your grandfather said, oh shit, here comes one of those damn Democrats. That was the first profanity that I ever heard in my life. And
there's kind of a buzz that is, wait, yeah, just move. It's just not. Because you cut off, because they cut off the, okay, can you hear it?
can I continue with one of these?
Yeah.
Okay, let's just go.
Hand him the mic.
Just put it close to your face.
Okay.
All right, sorry to interrupt
I
you,
was
sir.
hoping to avoid that. Thank you for not stepping on the punchline.
There's a special circle in hell reserved for people who step on the punchline.
So far as I know, it may have been the only 2 profane words that she ever uttered. But she wanted to communicate to me at this tender age that our family was not pro-slavery, pro-Confederate Democrats. We were Lincoln Republicans. And indeed, another of my great-great-grandfather was almost hanged in that same area with the accusation that he was a damned old Lincolnite. So this gives you the buried Unionist history of those mountainous counties in North Alabama. Alabama is divided into the mountainous north and the flat cotton-producing south. And that's a regional division that continues to this day.
So your predecessors were Northern Alabama Hill people, but you yourself were raised in Birmingham, lace curtain, new car in the garage, black housekeepers, prosperous, a different kind of culture. Without dwelling on it, did it feel like the New South was a different South? Far from the troubles of poor white rural South in the North?
It felt like a gritty northern industrial city dropped into the South. Birmingham didn't exist until 1870. It was an economic colony of the United States Steel Company. So we had this odd hybridization. We were taught, because most of the steel executive came down from Pittsburgh and shipped all the money they made in Birmingham back to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
I tell anyone, when you go in the Frick Museum and see those wonderful old masters, they were bought by money from Birmingham. There are no Frick, or few Frick finance old masters in the Birmingham Museum. Let me get back on track here. It was an odd mix of northern and southern mores, I think it's accurate to say. We were taught to recite the Gettysburg Address and to sing Glory, Glory, Hallelujah in elementary school, I remember very distinctly. I also remember thinking very distinctly when we were told that Robert E. Lee had decided to support his native state rather than the United States, I remember thinking, that's idiotic. Alabama and any other state is a piddling thing compared to the nation that just won World War II. So there was this odd hybridization. That said, segregation was the most brutally enforced in Birmingham of any southern city. That's why Martin Luther King called it the Johannesburg of America. That's why he brought the crusade there in 1963. A pivotal event in my life, chapter 3 of this book is called The Centrality of Grady Steen Williams Hutchinson. This was, when I was 7 years old, this 16-year-old black woman came to be the housekeeper for my parents. Both of my siblings, who were older, had gone away to college. I was very lonely, and we bonded. I followed her around, peppering her with questions. And from her, she told me the information that young white children in segregated Birmingham were not supposed to know about. How the cops shot kids, assassin them. How the Birmingham police carried knives that they would throw down next to the victim they had shot. On the more humorous side, how one of her high school classmates had dumped Willie Mays because he had no future. At 16, she was sneaking into nightclubs and hearing great artists like Bobby Blue Bland. So she introduced me to a world that was hidden from almost all the white kids in Birmingham. So I had this unusual background of coming from a family that had no Confederate nostalgia, being allowed by my parents to form this association with this very lively, smart young black person. And two, my parents are unusual in another way. They did not allow the N-word in our home. And we were members of a church that was a source of great embarrassment to me because it was called the Church of God. And I hated having to write Church of God rather than Methodist or Baptist on my grade school card. But this Church of God was not Pentecostal. They had come out of the Lutheran tradition of the Pennsylvania Dutch country and the Methodist pietistic movement of the upper Midwest. They were somber believers in one universal church that was colorblind. In the years immediately after Reconstruction, they held the first integrated meetings in Alabama. And even in my childhood, at the annual camp meetings of this odd little sect, members of the black churches of God in Birmingham came to open-air meetings that, in direct defiance of Bull Connor's laws and practices. And I can think the only reason that they got away with it is we were considered too insignificant to bother with. But I had this unusual upbringing, not being indoctrinated at the dinner table or in my church with this crippling racism that infected tens of thousands of white people my age in the South, and from which many of them have never recovered.
So your immediate family were so-called Lincoln Republicans in the late stage. There were moderates in the racial divisions of that place and time, but they were not among the 1% of whites who were marching with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were not fans of Medgar Evers on gathering. In fact, civil rights was kind of out of bounds. Now, in my own memory, living in the deep Georgia in the early 60s, in the late 60s, I remember when Martin Luther King was shot, and my mother, who was a moderate Republican also, said he had it coming to him. Oh, he was asking for it. That's what he said. He was asking for it. So there was a small space for, your family were not progressives, I'm getting at. They were somewhere in a neutral space that was out of danger.
Yeah, they were not activists. That is what we're getting at. But they regarded overt expressions of racism in language and behavior as a sign of ignorance. And they were New Southerners in the sense that they had come to town from the country, they had become prosperous enough to have a beach house and to drive Cadillacs, and they did not want to be identified with the ignorance of Wallace, Alabama, which was on the rise at that time. My parents, in the days when being nominated as a Democrat for the governor of Alabama was tantamount to election, they always supported the least racist available Democrat, because they were all racist and all segregationists, but they would go for the most civilized of this. So it's a very nuanced world that influenced me. And then another great event happened to me when I discovered the book called Starsville, Alabama, when I was a freshman in college, but I don't want to get ahead of your
Oh, that's all right. I would wonder if you could read a 300-word, a 200-word bit about Birmingham, 1964, an excerpt from your book, about the first job that you got in journalism.
By the early 1960s, thanks to Starsville, Alabama, and Birmingham Southern College, I became a chronic asker of questions about Alabama. Then, a few weeks after passage of the 1964 Public Accommodations Act, I became a professional one when I was hired at 21 by the Birmingham Post-Herald. The old racial patterns still persisted in Alabama politics, and some newspapers, despite the new civil rights law, let's see, there's a
glitch there in the
yeah,
printout?
but I'll get past it. Anyway, I'm at this newspaper. The new civil rights law has just been passed, and covering the implementation of the law was like living in a random, ill-managed, and dangerous sociological study. Being young was no disadvantage. It was all hands on deck for a breaking news hurricane. Within months, I was covering important stories like the desegregation of Birmingham schools, unhinged speeches by George Wallace, and the death watch at a Birmingham hospital for the Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister mortally clubbed by Klansmen after the Selma March. As a gesture of civic responsibility, the Birmingham Post-Herald raised money to offset the Reeves family medical expenses. I gave $50 to the fund, and my name was published on the front page of the paper along with those of other contributors. It was a clear breach of journalistic ethics that I never repeated, but it also marked my coming out at a time when Wallace's slogan was "Stand Up for Alabama." I had been too fearful to march with Dr. King in 1963, but now I was ready to stand for a different Alabama. I rationalized my activism as fulfilling the Post-Herald's masthead slogan, "Give the people light and they will find a way." By 1967, I was still toying with the idea of becoming an English professor, so I enrolled in graduate school and took a full-time job at the Tuscaloosa News to support myself. I was proud to be working for Buford Boone, the most courageous anti-Klan and anti-Wallace editor in the state. My time in his newsroom enabled me to assemble for this book an overview of Klan connectivity that I've never seen anywhere else. It draws on linkages I might have missed, but for my obsession with Alabama's ignored past and experiences on my native ground.
Great. Let's move to the Civil War aspect of your book. The Civil War story gets underway in chapter 6. And the book is a kind of corrective because it tells the story of the 1st Alabama Union Cavalry, a roster of 2,000 who fought for the Union and burned Atlanta with William Tecumseh's Sherman. Tell us about Christopher Sheets and the 1st Alabama. Who was Christopher Sheets?
In a fairer world, where history was not ignored or covered up, he would be one of the most famous figures in Alabama history as a patriot. Christopher Sheets was a 21-year-old mountain school teacher. He stunned North Alabama when he ran against the county's biggest plantation owner and defeated him 500 votes to 100 votes for a seat in the secession convention. In Montgomery, he joined a group of 24 of the 100 delegates who refused to sign the Ordinance of Secession, which unleashed a tirade from William Lowndes Yancey, the great orator who did more than any other single speechmaker to cause the Civil War. He brought South Carolina out of the Union even before he brought Alabama out. Chris Sheets is immediately singled out as a dangerous personage. He goes back to North Alabama and starts working through the forest at night to urge young farm boys, for the most part, from the Alabama hills, that cluster of 20-plus counties, to sneak north and join the Union Army. An estimated 3,000 Alabamians voluntarily, white Alabamians, voluntarily enlisted in the Union Army as a consequence of his anti-war activism.
Alabama was a majority black state at the time, correct? 500,000 enslaved people.
And about that number.
And about that number of whites.
Yeah.
Were any of the Raines family or the Best family enslavers?
Not so far as I have discovered, but that is a subject, as your own work explores, from which no white Southerner should ever say never.
Right.
Because it was such a pervasive practice. So far as I know, we were simply too poor and too politically committed against secession to have owned slaves. But I would not be surprised to find in the historic record.
Yeah.
But the key point for my book was that I discovered through a document that I call my Rosetta Stone, that I had several relatives who were in the Union Army. I had never nailed that down until 1988. My uncle, my late uncle, Brack Walker, was an art professor at Memphis State University. He was a UCLA-trained artist, a man of considerable sophistication. He called himself a Winston County existentialist. In 1958, he sat my mother's parents down at their dining room table and drew a family tree. And in 1988, at my grandmother's 100th birthday, he gave me a copy. And it is the only extant copy of this very strange document. It reflects kind of the oral history and also the artist's hand. I have it framed on my wall at home. But from it, I learned that at least 3 of my Walker relatives had served in the Union Army at around the time Sherman was getting ready to march on Atlanta.
But not in this unit that we were talking about, the 1st Alabama Cavalry.
Yes, actually.
Yes, in that
yeah,
group.
some of them.
So they joined this group, they joined the so-called March to the Sea, the Victory March of Tecumseh Sherman that's ranged from Chattanooga through Atlanta, down to Savannah, then up into South Carolina. And it was the episode that won the Civil War for the South,
Yeah.
more or less. Did the 1st Alabama, which was 2,000 men, make any difference in Sherman's army, which was 60,000, mostly Ohioans and Illinois recruits?
They made quite a difference, and that is the reason that the title of my book says how these Alabamians got written out of history. They are mentioned only sparingly in any of the Alabama histories, and always in negative tones. They were disgruntled hillbillies, jealous of the wealth of the plantation owners. They were opportunists, robbing their neighbors. They were, they don't use, the Alabama historians did not use the term white trash. They referred to them as the mudsill class, the lowest of the low.
Yeah.
The reason that they got in the Union Army is fascinating in itself. When Chris Sheets in 1862 starts this clandestine organizing, in April of 1862, the Union Army captured Huntsville, Alabama. And that became a destination for these country boys slipping through the forest at night on dirt roads and old Native American trails. They became so numerous in Huntsville that in July of 1862, General Don Carlos Buell sent a message to Lincoln's War Department saying, I want to organize the Alabama Volunteers, that's what he called it, into their own regiment. And to show that this was a serious undertaking, they assigned Captain Bankhead from the New York, very important New York recruiting office of the Union Army to come to Alabama and take command. So this was, again, the irony is these people are missing from Alabama history, except in terms of being insulted for the most part. Their military record was dismissed as being of no distinction. And yet, within a matter of months, they'd come to the attention of Abraham Lincoln, who was so engaged with them that he reprimanded the 1st Alabama commander for executing a deserter. Lincoln did not like these drumhead court-martials. They came to Grant's attention as very effective fighters in fencing off Nathan Bedford Forrest from Natchez, which was about to fall to Union hands. And they came to the attention of Sherman, who recognized that they were very useful as spies and as fighters. So he handpicked them to accompany him on the march to the sea. He picked 20 members of the 1st Alabama, including a young lieutenant named David Snelling, who was a Georgia Unionist, to travel as his personal bodyguard from Chattanooga to Atlanta to Savannah. They carried his, this is from Sherman's own memoirs, they carried his cigars and his whiskey. They built his campfire every night. And yet they are absent from all of the big screen histories of the Civil War. And more important, not to take you all the way through the march from Chattanooga to Atlanta to Savannah, which brought the war to an end. They were regarded with such distinction by General Francis P. Blair of the famous Blair family of Washington, D.C., that he awarded them the place of honor at the front of the Union Victory Parade through Savannah in Christmas week of 1865. And yet, as I say, they were not only written out of Alabama history. As a consequence of that, they're missing from the big screen histories by Bruce Canton and all of the histories that we read. And to bring it up to more modern times, they were omitted from Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. Had it not been for that, I think they would be as famous as the 54th Massachusetts, the famous black infantry unit depicted in the movie Glory. So that's sort of a capstone. They were written up in the New York Times. When their colonel came to New York on a vacation, he was lauded for bravery in the Times. They appeared in the Cincinnati papers. They appeared in the California papers. It makes it, they were, not to put too fine a point on it, at center stage, associated with the most famous generals on the Union side in the final act of the Civil War. If the Civil War was depicted in an opera, they would have been on stage in the chorus at every point.
You mentioned Ken Burns, which brings us to the third strand of the book, which is the complaint, if you like, the criticism of the lost cause mythology. There are two characters who play a big part in the book. One is William Archibald Dunning, whom you call the Lion of Manhattan Society, and another was Walter Fleming. Can you tell us about those two guys?
I can, and these are the architects of the lost cause mythology. And it's so fitting that we're here in New Jersey, and we'll turn to Dunning first. William Archibald Dunning was born in Plainfield, New Jersey. He went to Princeton, got kicked out. He went to Columbia, got his PhD by 1885. He had a very odd upbringing. His father was a Plainfield industrialist and arts patron who felt that who identified with Southern plantation owners as his class peers. He felt they had been unfairly denigrated and attacked in Reconstruction. He regarded them as aristocratic in manners, cultivated in their private life, cultured people who, as businessmen like himself, were trying to do the right thing, but had a labor problem. So Dunning was raised in this pro-Confederate atmosphere in what was then probably the most famous or most prosperous suburb in New Jersey. Plainfield, I'm told, had the first direct connection by train to Wall Street. In any event, Dunning then, by 1900, and until his death in 1921, he was the most famous historian at Columbia University and in the United States. His pro-Confederate views prevailed in American historiography until 1960, the start of the Civil Rights Movement. Only then did scholars start picking apart this myth of the Gone with the Wind South and its glorification, cultured, educated people who had been dealt with unfairly as villains in history. His classes at Columbia soon became what one historian called a mecca for young Southerners who wanted to get their PhDs. This is in the period 1900 and 1920, when doctorates had just come onto the scene in American academia, and he produced 7 young PhDs and dispatched them to southern campuses from the Carolinas to Louisiana. And they set the tone of the lost cause worship in southern universities that was very much still in full flower when I became a student there in the early 1960s. Walter Linwood Fleming was a plantation boy from Alabama. His father owned a small plantation. It was not so successful that he was not spared picking cotton as a young man. He goes to Auburn University and studies under a remarkable historian there who was a PhD from Johns Hopkins. Through this man and through Thomas McAdory Owen, the chief archivist of the state of Alabama, he is sent to Columbia, which was then in Midtown Manhattan, and quickly becomes the star pupil and the apple of William Archibald Dunning's eye. Long story short, Dunning dispatches him to the South. He soon becomes the Dean of Graduate Education at Vanderbilt University. And he was the mentor, the godfather of the Southern Agrarian movement. Those Southern writers and historians who established the myth of Southern nobility as the core doctrine of lost cause scholarship.
One or two more questions, and then we'll have some questions from everybody else. Has the lost cause not been retired in the South now? Richmond is a city that is stripped of its monuments. And where does the lost cause live now? Has it been sublimated into a politics of color that is no longer recognizable as deriving from the fight over enslavement? Do you agree, first of all, that the lost cause myth has been retired?
No, and I'll tell you why. Historians know something that they seldom share with the general public. You have to dig into the scholarship to find it. History is not what happened, it's what gets written down. And what gets written down is usually dictated by politicians and by the people in charge of the majority culture. Professor Janey at the University of Virginia, who's very active right now in scholarly writing, says that in fact lost cause doctrine is now at the centerpiece of Trump policy.
Okay.
And in my own experience, and Kristen and I lived in Alabama for winters for the past 15 years, there's been a big resurgence, specifically, or especially among well-educated, well-traveled, affluent Republicans of the old doctrines. Obviously, the racist language is not as blatant as it used to be, but the underlying culture of denigration of the poor and the people of color, I think, is stronger now than it's been at any time in my professional lifetime. And I should say, after the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act and the '65 Voting Rights Act, the South went through an interregnum of political process. You saw biracial governments in all the major cities. You saw famous black politicians in Atlanta like Andrew Young and Maynard Jackson. Now that's all being wiped out. There's some vestigial biracial governments in places like Birmingham and Selma, but the progressive aura that prevailed after the civil rights victories of the 1960s has pretty much dissipated.
Well, that folds into my last question. When you were 25 in the 1960s, the Klan was resurgent in Alabama, and you describe a high tide of militant white racial identity exemplified by the bombing career of Chambliss. What is Chambliss's first name?
Robert.
Robert Chambliss.
Known to Bull Connor as Dynamite Bob.
The man who bombed the 16th Street Church in Birmingham.
Yeah.
Now, suppose someone might say there is a resurgent white racism spilling out around the country and that it may be encouraged by one of the leading presidential candidates. Someone might say, are there any similarities between 1960s Alabama and 2020s America in that? I probably just made that declaration a moment ago.
Well, I want to elaborate to this degree. But by accident of the timing of my birth, I wound up starting my career covering the most gifted political demagogue in the South in the late 20th century, George Wallace. Now, in my golden years, I'm watching the rise of the most sinisterly gifted political demagogue of the new century. And to me, here's the commonality. The political demagogue is able to get otherwise smart, worthy people of good principles to believe and endorse practices they would not otherwise support. And to me, right now, the most obvious fact of the current political landscape is we have a 50-50 divide in this country who believe in fact-based, principle-based politics and people who believe in a kind of politics that's a melange of conspiracy theories and fake news, to coin a term. So I think, Wellington said of Waterloo, it was a close run thing as to whether Napoleon could be turned back. And I think this election is going to be a very close run thing. And I think if this almost terrifyingly gifted demagogue Trump is elected, I think we'll see some very harsh times. And to tell you how this can happen in an otherwise orderly society, after George Wallace made his segregation forever speech in January of 1961, there were, within the next 2 years, 12 roadside murders in Alabama of persons of color or of white people who were supporting the civil rights movement. So I won't dilate more on the scenarios, but I'm very worried.
And with that cheerful observation, I would like to ask you all to ask a question of Mr. Raines or make an observation. Yes.
Is this working? Is it on? It's on the button time. Use this one?
How about now? Okay, seems like we're ready to go.
As a newspaper man, if you were still executive editor of the New York Times, what would you do differently as a journalistic response to the times that we're in with the demagogue currently running for president?
I don't have a facile answer to that, because I thought establishment journalism, including the Times and the Washington Post, went through a very important barrier during the Trump presidency when they started labeling untrue statements as lies.
Right, I remember that.
That was a significant development in the traditional value system of journalistic language. And I do not think that the Trump tribe, the half of the American people who represent the Trump tribe, are within reach of fact-based reasoned argument. So I don't have a critique really to launch again. I don't know exactly what I would do. That's as honest as I can be about it.
Thank you so much, from a historian. Ed Ball asked the questions I was going to ask. Your last questions were that. So let me ask a question that has to do, I'm following up on what Kate just asked about now. I'm a recovering Southern historian. And for much of that time, I kind of felt that white Southerners were the outspoken nature of a lot of white Americans. Nowadays, we hear all this hand-wringing of how do we understand that Biden is not catching on? Why do so many Americans dislike Biden? We don't understand it. And speaking as a Southerner, to the both of you actually, do you think that his association with black people, his appointing black people, has infected him for many Americans?
That's an interesting take, and I think that probably has an element of truth in it. And I go back to the Obama administration, when there was a hardcore of white people who were surprisingly biased against Obama because of his skin color. Jimmy Carter was the first major politician to call them out. I think Trump's use of racist symbols and the adoption of lost cause imagery has fed into this. My concern about Biden, not to tell you things that you already know, the erosive effect in journalism of Fox News cannot be underestimated. It's now 2 decades old. Rupert Murdoch brought to American journalism the germ of partisanship that he learned in the London papers. This is the first time in our post-World War I history when we've had a major continuing entity devoted to the welfare of one party. So I think the debilitating effect of that we're seeing in the attacks on Biden, and the doubts about Biden fed by people who you would think would otherwise be analytically capable of seeing through the fog of demagoguery. The other thing I really worry about, I covered the Carter and Reagan campaigns for the New York Times on assignment from my friend David Jones. And one of the things that I remember about them, as different as they were both very good political performers. Carter at his peak, Reagan in his campaigns, both could deliver in the moment, on the stage, in the spotlight. And the age issue that we hear so much about worries me, because I worry about Biden's performative capabilities over the next 6 months. And so I must say, I thought the State of the Union was a needed spark. And I should also say that Katie Britt's rebuttal reminds us that Alabama will not willingly give up its tradition of having the most clownish members of Congress.
Back to the Civil War. It's curious, the first Alabama that you mentioned moved over the line to join the Union. At the same time, how did the Union accept them in terms of spies? I mean, I'm wondering, you have a couple of thousand Southerners coming and saying, we want to fight for you. This is like spy heaven.
It was.
I'm curious.
And this I'll touch briefly on this. It brings us to Grenville P. Dodge, who was Lincoln's favorite political general. Lincoln liked him so much that he arranged for the government to build the Union Pacific Railroad with government funds. And Dodge, of course, built that railroad. Dodge was a natural-born spy master. He came in by political appointment, didn't go to West Point. But he had a natural understanding that infiltration was superior to reconnaissance in force. That is, men on horseback galloping into the enemy camps to count the Alabamians. Dodge put together Grant's Secret Service, which stretched in several hundred members, stretching from Virginia to New Orleans. And the core of that was 20 members of the 1st Alabama who Dodge gave travel money to, sent them through the lines in civilian closings. So it was a fortuitous happenstance. And to this day, Dodge is known in military annals as the father of military intelligence. And it was just a flash of brilliant intuition.
Yeah, Hal, I just wanted to ask, is it really more a matter of the toxic partisanship that Rupert Murdoch brought over to the U.S. when he purchased the companies that he owns now? Or is it something that, I worked for the company for a while, and I had more the sense that it was just the fact that he was serving a niche. He saw a niche that could make money, and he just mined it, to the depths. So I'm not so sure that he had that political motive in mind, but I think somehow it was already there that part of the country either is uneducated, they don't want to think independently, they don't give a crap about what the facts are, they just want, like you said, performance.
I could go on for a long time about Rupert. Let me just say this. His birthplace newspapers in Australia were militantly anti-monarchist. He goes to London, buys papers that become royalist papers promoting Queen Elizabeth. He sees the satellite communications industry arising. He makes a bargain with Margaret Thatcher that his newspapers will support her if she will give him the license to that star satellite. I've forgotten the term of art, but I think it was the star system. So at every point, his principles are fungible, and his eye is always on the main chance. Ed Koch told me that he would never have been elected mayor of New York if the New York Post hadn't supported him at Murdoch's behest. So this is someone who uses journalistic power recklessly, but now it's a new thing on the American scene. The thing that none of us could have predicted in my generation of journalists was that the most powerful communications instrument invented since the printing press would turn out to be morally neutral and factually neutral. It carries everything on an unfiltered basis, and I think that's the core problem that we have in a largely undiscriminating public. I can't predict what is going to happen in communications. I mean, I'm amazed that the New York Times has managed to bridge its way to economic success without sacrificing its core principles. And I'm pleased that we've got some beneficent millionaires supporting papers like the Washington Post. But the future of market-based journalism in this country is very much up in the air.
I just wanted to ask you what happened to the 3,000 people who fought during the Reformation. Did they become activists, during the Reformation as well?
The 3,000 Alabamians in the Union Army?
Reconstruction.
Reconstruction.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Reformation is another topic.
All right,
Not sure we have time.
Reconstruction, sorry.
Here's Edward's great book about his slave-owning plantation ancestors. Singles out, I think it was a group of 852 freed slaves who, according to your calculation, had something like 75,000 descendants.
That's right.
My wife Christina used similar mathematics and came up with this. The 3,000 white Alabamians who voluntarily enlisted now have an estimated 186,000 direct descendants. That means thousands of white Alabamians are descended from Union soldiers and don't know it. And this is what the real sinister part of falsified history, buried history, ignored history, politicized history brings us to. It robs people of their identities.
Hi, good evening. So I'm actually a history teacher in a public high school nearby here in New Jersey. And I wanted to ask you, I guess a little bit of a controversial question relevant to the Civil War, but in Civil War memory. So I'm actually having a discussion about this probably in about a week or two. So here's the question. What should states and perhaps the federal government do about Confederate flags hung in public? Should all Confederate statues be placed somewhere else, perhaps in museums? Where should they go? And I guess my only comparison to this is in Germany, Nazi flags have been banned. In Eastern European countries, the flags of the Soviet Union are banned, and so on. So, anyway, thank you.
The Mellon Foundation, is that right, Christina?
Yes.
Has just started, I think it's a $400 million program to examine these questions. I think outright bans are, I think, outside our tradition and probably unsupportable and counterproductive. My own preference is that these monuments should be treated as historical artifacts, and museum housing and so forth being an option. And what the Mellon Foundation is also doing is studying those minority groups based on color, based on religion, or based on women being discriminated against in the telling of history, to restore a new generation of monumentalism, as it were. So I think that Mellon initiative is the most promising thing that I see on the horizon.
How's your book doing in Florida? You don't have to answer that. A quick point, Lee Highway is a major highway in Virginia and leads right up practically to Washington, D.C. But following up the gentleman's question in the back, after the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction where there was great progress, and then, including the Supreme Court, things started to slide backwards.
Yeah.
And if you can kind of maybe, throw everything together from your book and
Well, the end of Reconstruction was marked by the Democratic Party saying, we will let the South run its own race relations if they will support us. And that's the bargain that continued through Franklin D. Roosevelt and into the modern era. So that the original sin was saying race is a local option. The thing I would analogize to that, without going on too long, Mitch McConnell 20 years ago figured out if he took over the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. Senate, he could produce a Supreme Court that was thoroughly politicized. And so I think, you know, the shelf life of political sin, not to put too fine a point on it, is long and not easily corrected.
Thank you both for very thoughtful and enlightening discussion. I am not a historian, I don't even play well on TV, but I am an immigrant who brings probably a different eye to this. And I go back to where I came from. And I see, for example, Germany, I'm not from Germany, but I see Germany voting right now based in the East. The West Germans were taught that Nazism was bad. And the East Germans were taught, we're socialists and we always did good. And East Germans are voting super right-wing right now because they have been duped, like you say, the South has been duped into some thinking that they are superior and they were good and Ausländer raus, you know? And so sorry about this little soliloquy, but I want to ask you, you seem to think that journalism can be neutral. So if I went to Germany, I could read a newspaper that's SPD, I can read a newspaper that's CDU, I knew what I was reading. When I came to America, I didn't know what I was reading. There was an undertone of this or undertone of that, and a pretension that this was neutral. And can you really have neutral and true journalism, or can you, or should you have opinion?
Well, clearly opinion journalism is the marketplace favorite of the news industry now. And the debate over objectivity, as it was called in my day, has been raging in journalistic and academic circles. I'll just dodge your question with this anecdote. When I moved to London as the New York Times bureau chief, I subscribed to 7 newspapers. And I would read them every morning and try to form a theory of what really happened. And I never really succeeded in breaking down the partisanship. And that's why I single out Murdoch as a villain in my lifetime in journalism. The professionalization of journalism that we took for granted for many years really was the product of post-World War II era, when American journalists decided they would not be the political instruments of their publishers. And that produced what we came to call mainstream journalism, which is to say, it's a new thing, it didn't always exist, and I think we're seeing the end game, and I don't know what replaces that. That's why I'm going to write books for now.
I'm Carla Baranakis, and I had the pleasure of working in your newsroom at the New York Times. One of the things I wonder about is how much of your research of your book involved looking at archival newspapers in various places, and do you think the way the industry is going now, do you think historians in the future are going to have a much harder time?
Yeah, I think they are. I think citizens in the future are going to have a much harder time too, Carl. Good to see you. I am not a historian, and one of the things I'm pains to say in this book is the historical research here is not mine. I used the techniques of investigative journalism as I learned it at the 6 newspapers I worked for, including the New York Times, which is to get as diverse a set of inputs. So I, used dozens of history books. I used unknown master's theses. I used dissertations from a variety and I used newspapers. And newspapers in the Civil War era were very valuable, even though they were highly partisan. My predecessor as editorial page editor of the New York Times, John Raymond, was Lincoln's campaign manager in 1864. So, so much for objectivity, right? I don't want to sound pessimistic about the future. It's not in my nature, but here's the thing that troubles me when we try to sort through these questions. Traditionally, in a democracy, a landslide is 60% of the vote. That means 4 out of 10 people, even in the times of greatest political accord, disagree with a majority opinion. So a majority in democracy is a very fragile thing. Right now, as best I can tell, we're at 50-50. And which way it's going to fall, if we could get back to 60-40, I think the country would be much more stable. Let me return to George Wallace and Donald Trump, the analogy, for just a minute. There was this key difference between these 2 men, and I knew both of them. I covered Wallace a lot back before he cleaned up his act, and I've had some exposure to Trump in New York through the Times. The difference between them as demagogues is that George Wallace had a moral center. He knew he was defying his church and democratic principles. He did it for the most venal way. Reverend Joseph Lowry, one of Dr. King's associates, told him after the Selma March, he said, they met in his office, he said, Governor, I'm not talking to you as an elected official, and I'm not talking to you as a civil rights leader. I'm talking to you as a Methodist minister to a Methodist layman. God has given you great oratorical talents, and he's going to call you to account for how you use them. And I think after Wallace was shot, he came to view what happened to him as a moral judgment, hence his later attempts to reach out to the black community. As evil and calculating as he was, George was operating with a moral compass, even though he was ignoring it. I don't think Trump has a moral center, a moral compass, a core set of ethics, and that's why I think we are in such extremely dangerous times. Thank you so much. I don't want to impose on your time, and I want to thank everybody.